everybody. My name is Craig Richardson. I am the president of the Energy and Environment Legal Institute, or E&E Legal as we go by. And I wanted to welcome you this morning to this panel. We're excited to have our panelists, which will be introduced more properly in a second. But as I said, E&E Legal is the sponsor of that. On behalf of myself and our board member, Steve Malloy, who is also on the panel, we welcome you to the panel and to CPAC. E&E Legal, for those of you who don't know, is a 501c3 organization based here in the inside or behind enemy territories, I like to say, inside the belt. We use strategic litigation to try to expose, at least in recent years, the extensive collusion that's gone on with the environmental green groups and the government itself in order to put every environmental regulation you can conceive of and to destroy our energy system and our economy. Hopefully things will change as we move forward in this new dynamic. Our moderator today is John Fund, who I know most of you, or I'm sure all of you know, if you've ever read the Wall Street Journal and other outlets, distinguished outlets. We also have with us Tony Heller. Tony Heller of Real Science, and again, a much more distinguished bio, which John will get into. I mentioned Steve already, who, not in addition to being a board member with us, has also had a career in and coined the phrase essentially junk science. He's been a real advocate of exposing the underlying science that has led to many of these destructive policies, and he's going to hopefully be in a position to try to undo some of that bad science. And then finally, all the way from the UK, we have James Dellenpole, who's an English columnist and a novelist and the executive director of Breitbart News Network out of London. And James, we haven't had this much anticipation here in the United States for a Brit since 1964 when the Beatles arrived.
Nothing to live up to.
Yeah, no pressure.
No pressure. And with that, I would like to introduce have our moderator, John Fund, come up.
Thank you. Well, we can't compete with Kellyanne Conway, my old friend on the main stage, but thank you for coming. This panel comes at a particularly opportune time because if you view the climate change debate as having been frozen in amber for a great deal of time, with two competing factions warring over what is a consensus and what isn't a consensus, what is warming and what isn't warming, we're about to have things shaken up. The new administration in the United States takes a different view. Its appointees have different priorities. And I think now we have the prospect of having a real debate. Now, I do not pretend to be an expert on climate issues, but I did want to give you my perspective on how I discovered there was something terribly, terribly wrong on this issue in the conventional wisdom. I used to speak fairly frequently at the Aspen Ideas Festival, which is sort of the Woodstock of the Birkenstock wearing cultural liberal elite. And they would occasionally have me there as an affirmative action host, moderating the panel. You know, sometimes I'd be on a panel and therefore my role would change to that of pinata. But one year they decided that since I wasn't an expert on climate, I would be perfect to moderate a panel on climate, since all four panelists, of course, already take the conventional wisdom view that the world is falling apart and Chicken Little has arrived. So I moderated the panel, and I paid close attention to what my four panelists said. All of them said two things that were interesting. One, it was no longer global warming. It was climate change. It had been a shift in the brand market. Two, that this necessitated an incredible change in government policy, private consumption, and the economy. Big changes. Tom Lovejoy of the Smithsonian was asked, what specifically are you talking about when you're saying big changes? And he said, well, just to roll back the emissions to the levels that we aren't getting worse, we're going to have to go back to the level of emissions when Robert Fulton took out his steamboat, the Claremont of the Hudson River in 1807. And I said, wow, And another panelist said, well, basically we're going to have to be growing a lot of grubs in order to get our protein. So this intrigued me. So the first question I had for the panelists, and this is where my downfall of the Aspen Ideas Festival began, my first question was, please explain to me, because I'm told marketing is very important, please explain to me the significance of the change from your movement from global warming to climate change, and exactly why was it done? And I went down the panelists. This was a very uncomfortable question. Finally, the second panelist piped up, and you know how you sometimes, if you ask something innocently enough, sometimes the truth will pop out? This panelist actually said, well, you see, with global warming, you actually have to argue if it's warming. With climate change, the climate is always changing. And I said, aha! Fortunately, I said this into the mic, which attracted the attention of the audience. So I knew I was on thin ice, and then I committed the final act of harakiri. They'd gone through the 4 stages of how we would have to dismantle our modern economy and basically go back to 1807 steamship, Robert Fulton. How we're going to have lead a much simpler life, make do with a lot less. And I said, oh, well, this is all very interesting. And then we had a coffee break. And during the coffee break, an announcement was made over the loudspeakers that the official bottled water of the Aspen Ideas Festival, Fiji water, was proud to announce its sponsorship of the Aspen Ideas Festival, and proud to announce that it had distributed 10,000 bottles of water so far during the conference. It was basically one of the PSAs that you get on public television. So we came back, we reassembled, and then we went to the questions and answers from the audience. And before that I said, well, we've been talking about changing our lifestyles and changing our way of life because we have to go back to an economy like 1807. And I say, well, I have a suggestion. And there was a bottle of Fiji water in front of me, as there was in front of every one of the panelists. And I picked it up and I looked at it and I said, do you realize this came from Fiji? Do you realize how much carbon emission it took to not only get this out of the wells in Fiji, but then to put it on ships, bottle it, and bring it here to Aspen, Colorado, so we could enjoy Fiji water? We were sitting outside the tent, and right behind us was this roaring mountain stream, and I said, at the same time, there's completely pure water just behind us in this wonderful pure mountain stream. I said, maybe we should start with this. What is this doing here at an environmental conference? This Fiji water. And one of the panelists immediately whispered in my ear, trying to stop me. They're sponsoring it, you idiot. Well, I plowed forward. I was on board. And then one of the panelists was Carol Browner, the former head of the Environmental Protection Agency. Now, to Carol's credit, she actually has led a crusade against the wastefulness and non-utility of bottled water for a long time. So she immediately piped up and started this Jeremiah against bottled water. And it was picked up by people in the audience. So we suddenly had this incredible anti-bottled water campaign going on the panel. And then there was a sound off in the distance, sort of like a bellow. And sure enough, it was the co-chair of the Aspen Ideas Festival and the owner of Fiji Water, who's, what is her name? I think it was Wiener. Wexler. Resnick. It was, yes, Resnick. Mrs. Resnick was arriving. She had heard there was dissidents in the ranks, and dissidents were on the stage attacking her product. She literally barged into the meeting, and there was double the size of this audience at the meeting, and started yelling, "How dare you attack," this is interrupting the panel, "how dare you attack Fiji water?" And I said, we're not attacking Fiji water, we're just pointing out what's going to have to go if we're discussing dramatic changes in the climate and the economy. Well, this was a royal good time. It made the Aspen newspaper, it made the Denver Post, it made me famous and infamous at the same time. And since then, I have never been invited back to the Aspen. A small price to pay for speaking truth to power. Anyway, that taught me the rottenness at the core of this whole scam. And to elucidate this scam, we have three very distinguished panelists. James Delingpole, Steve Malloy, and Tony Heller. They've already been introduced in part. If you want to go to your smartphones and get a full bio, I think we want to go to the meat of their discussion as quickly as possible, if you don't mind. So we're going to start with James Delingpole, who's an old friend of mine, runs Breitbart London, has been fearless when he was at the Daily Telegraph, and pioneering common sense on this issue, and is the author of a famous book, whose name escapes me.
Watermelons.
Watermelons, and you all know about watermelons. Do you know the origin of the term watermelon? Where it was first used?
Where? When?
Yes, do you know? I will tell you. I have a friend who attended the first meeting between the Western country environmental groups and the environmentalists of the Eastern Bloc after the fall of communism. They met in Madrid, Spain in 1989, and they were discussing how to work together now that the Berlin Wall and other things were falling down. And the Western environmentalists, some of them were appalled. The Eastern environmentalists, some of them were appalled that the representatives of freedom and capitalism and progress were so statist. Finally, there was an infamous scene in which one of the delegates from Czechoslovakia, which later divided, stood up on a table and literally yelled down and screamed at one of the Western environmental group leaders, saying, "I don't know why you're even here. Who invited you? You're not an environmentalist, you're a watermelon. I know your kind. You're green on the outside and you're red on the inside." That's actually the origin, and I can send you the citation. James Delingpole.
Thank
Whichever works. Ask the audience.
Which one? This one? Or this one?
Neither.
Okay. I'm James Delingpole. Thank you very much for having me, CPAC. I'm not going to diss our superb, magnificent sponsor, E&E Legal. They are magnificent and we should use their services for whatever they do. One correction, John. I'm actually not the editor of the Breitbart London site. My official title of Breitbart now is God Emperor.
Is that a promotion or
I just sort of float around on my God Emperor cloud and now, some of you may be looking at me now and see a sort of dried up, sad husk of a man. But let me tell you, I was once an incredibly glamorous figure with the world at my feet. In my glory days as a journalist, I used to get the coolest assignments you could imagine. I got sent up to South Africa once to go cage diving with great white sharks. I got lent a Honda Fireblade once, which is a really fast motorbike, to go around the Isle of Man TT course. I interviewed John Travolta, Harrison Ford, Samuel L. Jackson. I went out, I got flown out for 10 days to stay in the Sunset Marquee to interview Led Zeppelin. And in the meantime, while I was waiting for my interview to happen, I hung out by the pool with the Black Crows. It was just great. I had a really good, interesting life. So here I am now, stuck in a ghetto. The ghetto of climate change and energy, which I think you'll agree are not as glamorous as the after-show party with the Black Crows. It is not. Why did I do this? Why did I get involved in this strange netherworld, this sideshow in journalism? Well, I'll tell you. I discovered that this is the every journalist's dream. Every journalist dreams of the story where there is endless, low-hanging fruit. Every day, a new story emerges of the lunacy and romance and criminality of the bad guys you're writing about. And let me tell you, climate change is the gift that goes on giving. Obviously, if there are any liberals here, you will feel very differently. But I can tell you that the Greenies are some of the worst people in the world right now. They use environmental issues as a cloak of righteousness to disguise what are essentially bad intentions. And one of the occasions when I discovered this was a story that I helped break. You'll all have heard of ClimateGate. ClimateGate, there were these emails that were leaked from the University of East Anglia, or the University of Easy Access, as it's nicknamed by skeptics like me. And what these emails showed was that the scientists at the very, very heart of the people in charge of putting out the climate data, which we all rely on, which governments rely on to introduce their massive tax policies and so on, tax and regulation policies. These were the guys supplying the information. And what emerged from these emails was, well, various things. One of them was their tremendous intolerance, tremendously unscientific, I might say, intolerance to any dissenting voices in the environmental field. There was also a strong hint that these guys were messing with the data, and Tony and Steve are going to tell you more about this. I mean, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that these guys are basically crooks. This was really the first time that I think ordinary people began to realize that this story they'd been told in their school classrooms and read in the newspapers, this story that the world is getting dangerously hot and that it is caused by mankind, by man's selfishness and greed and refusal to amend his lifestyle, that maybe this story wasn't quite as true as the environmental correspondents and the scientists were telling us. So I don't come from a scientific background. I'm an arts major, I suppose you'd call me. But one of the things I was taught as an arts major was the important art of critical thinking. So you don't take anyone's word for it. You examine the evidence and form your own opinion, which is something I'm ashamed to say very few of the people in my journalistic trade have done. I think it's been a tremendous failure of the media. It's failure to cover this story, which I consider to be one of the greatest, well, it's certainly the greatest scientific scandal in history. What's been going on is appalling, and again, more details from my friends over there. So I read a book called Watermelons, green on the outside, red on the inside. And I set out in this book to answer the question that a lot of people ask me, which is, okay, so you're saying it's a conspiracy. I don't actually use the C word, by the way. I consider it more to be a sort of a concatenation of mutual interests. But, okay, if you want to use the C word, fine, because it almost is. But if it is a conspiracy, why do so many people from disparate groups, why would they all be tending towards the same aim? For example, why would businessmen get involved in the scandal? And why would scientists get involved? Because we know that scientists are pure. They wear these magnificent white coats. They're kind of like the priests of our time, aren't they? They're on a holy mission of truth. So why would the scientists lie to us? And why would the environmental campaigners lie to us? And why would the media lie to us? And what I discovered is that I'd say there were three main strands to this great big global warming con we've experienced for the last 30 years. One of them is religious. There's a great economist, I don't know whether you've heard of, called Julian Simon. Julian Simon was known as the Doomslayer, because while Rachel Carson and Paul Ehrlich were writing best-selling books about how we were all going to hell in a handcart,
the past 26 years, if you're familiar with Les Miserables and Inspector Javert, I've kind of been like Inspector Javert, doggedly after EPA. And so you can imagine my pleasure on November 9th at 3 o'clock in the morning when it's announced that Donald Trump is going to be president, because I've been selected to be on the EPA transition team. So I'm working on plans for fixing EPA. And it's a dream come true to, after, fighting EPA for 25 years, and, really it's been a tough battle because you can never win with EPA. EPA has, all the money, all the power. Democrat politicians are very rabid when it comes to the environment and the activists that live up to it. Republican politicians are terrible on the environment. They're just, it's like the environment is like the third rail of politics. They've always been afraid of it. And so you could never really count on support from them. Now over the years, through the work of people like Tony and Jay and myself, we've been able to stiffen some, produce some backbone in Republican Congress. And, even Mitt Romney did a 180 in 2012 on climate, and said he already did. So, while I'm very proud of that, nothing's made me prouder than the fact that Donald Trump is now president. During the campaign, Donald Trump was the only Republican candidate I have ever heard, say that he wanted to abolish the EPA. He said that many times. He also said he wanted to make it a very much smaller part of what it is now, but that's fine too. He recognized, and once again, he's the only candidate that did so, did it publicly multiple times, even though I can't see that he's really had any interaction with EPA. Certainly not like anyone in Congress. They should know about EPA. He knows that EPA has been engaged in regulatory overreach, and of course it struck a chord with me because ever since I worked on EPA issues, it's always been regulatory overreach. In 1970 when EPA was formed, yeah, the air wasn't as clean as it should be. Sometimes the rivers caught on fire. Okay, that was the price of industrialization at the time. But during the 60s and 70s, people became more aware of the environment. EPA was not a new creation; it was just a sort of consolidation of ongoing efforts, federal environmental protection efforts. And so, over the ensuing 47 years, well, actually, by the time I started, by 1990, the air was basically clean. Rivers didn't catch on fire anymore. They were pretty clean. The water. Industrial facilities had to discharge into rivers, or could discharge into rivers and lakes, had to be cleaner than the water in the rivers and lakes. Basically, had to be drinking quality water. Didn't admit anything into the air either. So everything was pretty much fine and dandy by then. EPA's mission had largely been accomplished, but of course EPA has gone on and has become this 15,000-man behemoth with an $8 billion budget. And over the last 8 years, it's been used to great effect by the administration to strangle our economy, in particular to destroy the coal industry. 90% of the equity in the coal industry was destroyed by the Obama administration. People think, well, that's because of fracking, production of natural gas. Well, that played only a very small part of it. The reality is that the Obama administration's rules put pressure on utilities. Fracking made coal cost competitive with coal, and so with all the political pressure on utilities, it's a no-brainer to switch out of coal and gas. So, but now things have changed. Now we have an administration that is, going to turn loose the American energy industry, recognizing that the environment is clean. We're going to keep it clean. Donald Trump talks about we want to have very clean air, very clean. Well, we're going to have the same clean air, clean water we've had for the last 20 years. What's going to happen though is EPA is not going to be allowed to run roughshod over the economy like that. As James alluded to, I think of environmentalism and EPA as kind of a shield behind which the left advances its social and political agenda. If the environment is camouflage. If you look at every solution is to shut down industry. The only industry that they approve of right now is, maybe wind and solar, but of course, try to get a permit to do something with wind and solar, you'll find out that environmentalists that really want to use it. So on the transition team, we spent 4 months working to put a plan together, and we got even more enthusiastic about it after November 9th. And I think you're starting to see the fruits of that plan. On January 21st, the day after President Trump was inaugurated, he announced the end of the Obama-era Clean Power Plan, which is EPA's global warming rules. I think now that Scott Pruitt has taken over as administrator of EPA. That plan to roll back the Clean Power Plan, which is really accomplishing nothing but further destroying the coal industry, is going to be rolled back. There's going to be a real war with environmentalists, no question about that. There's going to be a lot of litigation. But we're going to be moving EPA in the right direction. This morning, a petition signed by 300 scientists made its way to the White House, calling for the U.S. to pull out of not just the Paris Climate Treaty, but the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was the original 1992 Bush administration treaty, which has gotten us all in snarl. Whether President Trump chooses to withdraw us from the UNSCCC, which he can do with a stroke of the pen. The President has the power to do that, to withdraw from the treaty. We'll see. Certainly, I think that the Paris Agreement is going to be nullified. It may be just considered. I don't really think it was a legitimate agreement or a treaty to start with, but if we pretend for the sake of argument that it's a treaty, it was never ratified by the Senate, so we're not ratified. Now, the big mission that the Trump administration is going to need to do is to roll back something called the endangerment finding. Now, the endangerment finding is like a threshold determination that EPA makes, and the Obama administration made in 2009. That carbon dioxide and the other greenhouse gases was a threat to public welfare. How this can be possible is unknown because carbon dioxide is necessary for life. But the Obama administration calls it a pollutant. So they made it an air pollutant subject to regulation by the Clean Air Act. And that endangerment finding is going to have to be reproposed and revisited and debated, which of course it never was done the first time. The first time the Obama administration just sort of rammed it through with a predetermined conclusion that carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. So this time we're going to have a debate. People like Tony Heller are going to be able to participate in that debate. And I imagine it's possible we might have a different outcome this time. We have a fair presentation of both sides of the science. But the engagement finding needs to be appealed. So if it's not, then President Trump is going to be forced to issue his own climate rules. And I don't think that's something that he's going to want to do. Instead of the Obama climate plan, we have the Trump climate plan. I doubt that he wants to do that. So I think the endangerment finding will be revisited. That's going to be another war with environmentalists. All this stuff is going to be a war. It would be best if Congress made things easier on the administration by passing a bill saying that EPA can't regulate carbon dioxide. EPA was never expressly authorized to regulate carbon dioxide. John Dingell, Democrat lion from the House, one of the authors of the Clean Air Act, testified many times that Congress did not want expressly did not want EPA to regulate carbon dioxide. But the Supreme Court decided somehow on its own in the midst of global warming hysteria in 2007 that EPA could. And the Obama administration, EPA did. So that is what we need to move back. Now, it's very important that the Trump administration understand that. So to the extent anyone here talks to their congressman or the Trump administration about climate endangerment, remember those two words, that needs to be rolled back. With that, I will turn it to Tony.
Okay, I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and propose, unless there's objection, that technology cavalry is not quite here yet.
No,
It's on?
Yeah.
Okay.
control that.
Aha!
The on-off switch.
You get the prize for simple solutions to complex problems. So, with that, Tony, please return to the stage.
Well, it's great to be here. Thank you, John. Steve and James are esteemed friends of mine who've been key figures in exposing climate junk science over the last decade or so. It's great to be here with them. Hello?
Is the mic on?
I don't know. Yeah.
We can only solve one problem at a time.
Your mic's on. can't hear me?
Just speak up.
Okay. All right. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
None of them wrong. It's not on.
All right.
Speak
Okay,
up.
all right, I'll have to, I guess I don't have as loud a voice as some of the other panelists here. I'm a longtime environmentalist. In fact, 45 years ago, I testified at my first congressional hearing in Kanab, Utah, in support of the Escalante Wilderness Area, which President Obama finally created just last year. I was actually quite pleased about that. I was actively involved in the Clean Air and Water Act back in the 60s and 70s. And I've volunteered as a wilderness ranger for a number of years in New Mexico. And I've been involved in environmental issues all my life. So I come from this from a slightly different perspective. I'm a scientist. I was a longtime believer in global warming until I went and looked at the data myself. And I started digging through it. I was actually incredibly horrified at what I found. And basically, the topic of my presentation is climate fake news. Basically, everything you hear from the news in the press about climate is fake news. And I'm going to go through and show you some examples of it. See if I can get the slides up there. Got it. Okay, so fake climate news is not something new. Right now, conservatives get blamed for every bad weather event and for climate change. It's our fault. But hundreds of years ago, it was witches who were blamed for it. During the 16th century in Europe, tens of thousands of witches were burned at the stake for cooking the weather. It was perceived that the climate was changing and it had to be somebody's fault, so it was witches. And in fact, there's a theory, there's a Huffington Post article I've got up here, there was a theory that the Salem witch trials were the result of blame for climate change. That it was a particularly bad period of weather and it had to be someone's fault, so witches were blamed. The article on the right is one of my favorites from 1871 from the Pall Mall Gazette. The author is lamenting the fact that there's this widespread belief, an imaginary belief in climate change. And particularly interesting is the text I've highlighted at the bottom about how the people who are keeping the weather statistics are exaggerating everything to make it so that every season is the hottest, coldest, wettest, driest, windiest ever. So basically what we're seeing now is identical to what's been going on for a very long time. So a good example of this is fake man-made drought. This is a graph of the drought in California in the West over the last 1,200 years. Those big red mountains on the left side, those were multi-century droughts. For most of the time, California is in drought. But after a short period during the last century of unusually wet weather in California, they went back into a drought for a few years, that little blip on the right side. And that was declared to be man-made. This isn't science, this is superstition to believe that drought is the normal state of affairs in California. And of course, the solution to that drought was they implemented a carbon tax and built a $70 billion bullet train to nowhere in California, which was an obvious solution to climate, to drought. Okay, so I'm from New Mexico. This is Pueblo Bonito and Chaco Canyon. They were driven out by a 75-year-long drought in the 13th century. And I have my doubts that a carbon tax could have prevented it. Okay, so the California drought is particularly interesting because 40 years ago, in 1977, Governor Brown, the same one, was warning of a drought catastrophe, which at the time was blamed on global cooling. This was reported in the New York Times in 1977. And a year later, California was flooded. They had a foot of rain and were flooded. So fast forward to 2017, there's Governor Brown preparing for an unending drought in California, and the New York Times reporting that. So this time it was a global warming drought instead of a global cooling drought. And how did the drought end? Just like it did in 1977, a foot of rain, California is flooded. So the only thing, same government, same story, the only thing that changed is it went from global cooling to global warming. This is one of my favorites. I live in Boulder, Colorado.
Great.
Yeah.
I live in Palmer Lake.
Oh, great. Awesome. I love prairie dogs. They're one of my favorites. I commute on a bicycle and I go through a prairie dog town every day, take pictures of them, post them on my blog. The University of Colorado got $850,000 to study the effects of climate change on Boulder prairie dogs, which is great, except for the only problem is that if you look at the graph on the right, that's the official NOAA graph for Boulder temperatures. The climate isn't changing in Boulder. So how do you study something which isn't occurring? And actually, the only really large prairie dog town we had right in Boulder got taken away because the University of Colorado built a big building there. I'm not sure that's actually climate change. Let's go.
It's habitat change.
Pardon?
My 10-year-old takes care of our prairie dogs with his gun.
Okay, so another great fake news story is human attribution for sea level rise. This is a graph of sea level rise over the last 20,000 years. Sea level's risen about 400 feet in the last 20,000 years. Almost all of that occurred before 8,000 years ago. That was all natural, but somehow the last 3 inches of that 400 feet is our fault. And this is not science, this is just fake news, right? Here's another great project. This was a $6 million competition, which was just announced in California last week to study the effects of sea level rise in the San Francisco Bay, which is a great idea, except for one problem. The graph on the right is the NOAA tide gauge in the San Francisco Bay. Sea level is not rising there. Sea level is the same now in the San Francisco Bay as it was in 1940. So what are these people going to be studying with their $6 million? It's not happening. It's just fake news. Okay, so one of the standard techniques for generating this fake news is just changing the data. This graph shows 2 lines. Is the official NASA sea level graph is the black line from 1982, and the green one is the current one. The 1982 one was actually generated by James Hansen, the world's #1 climate alarmist, and he showed that sea level basically stopped rising after 1950. But the new NASA graph now shows an acceleration after 1950. So they just altered the data to create the fake news they needed for their funding. Another very famous one is getting rid of the medieval warm period. This is one that's been discussed greatly. The graph on the left is from the 1990 IPCC report. That big bump on the left side was a very warm period when Vikings were sailing through the Arctic and were farming Greenland. Went into a little ice age around 1600 and then warmed back up about halfway up back to the medieval warm period. And if you notice, I've highlighted T.R. Carl. That's Tom Carl, who was the National Climatic Data Center Administrator for many years. He just retired recently and was just recently involved in a scandal, which I'll talk about a little bit. Okay, so this was a big problem, right? Because global warming doesn't really work with this 1990 IPCC graph. So in 2006, David Deming, a geologist at the University of Oklahoma, testified before the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, and he said that he was approached by a famous person and a well-known researcher in climate change in the mid-90s and said, we've got to get rid of that medieval warm period. And that they did. In the 2001 IPCC report, we had Michael Mann's famous hockey stick, and you'll notice the medieval warm period is now gone. This was a well-established science. They plotted to make it disappear, and it did. Okay, another way of creating fake climate news is just by hiding data. The graph on the left is the NOAA. Their sea ice dating. Notice it starts in 1979 and it shows sea ice disappearing, right, since 1979. And what they always said was, well, we don't have any data from before 1979. But that simply isn't true because the 1990 IPCC report on the right notices data from NOAA has sea ice data going back to 1973. And what you notice is it was much lower in 1973. So they just removed that data because it was inconvenient. But it gets worse. This is a 1980, the graph on the left is a 1985 graph from the Department of Energy. And it showed sea ice going back to 1925. You notice it was way down around in the 1940s and 1950s. There was very little sea ice then, and then it rose up. So the graph on the right, I've concatenated the graph on the left and the one on the right and circled where the NOAA sea ice graphs start now. Look at it, they're starting it right at the peak. Of course ice is going down. If you start at the top of a mountain, there's only one direction to go, and that's down. So it's fake news. There's pretty good indication that sea ice in the 1950s was probably just as low as it is now. Okay, another thing which they've gotten rid of is the troublesome 1940s blip. The graph on the left is from the National Center for Atmospheric Research, which is in Boulder, Colorado, where I live. I ride my bicycle up there just about every day. And you notice, there's a temperature graph. What you see is temperatures warmed way up to around 1940, and then they cooled way back down in 1970. And actually, 1970 was cooler than 1870 in that graph, right? The graph on the right is NASA's current graph with the same thing. And notice there's no longer this post-1940 global cooling. It's disappeared. They've removed it. And then the graph on the left here is from the Climatic Research Unit in East Anglia, which we were discussing earlier, and it showed the same thing, the big 1940s blip and then cooling after that. Okay, and then the email on the right here is a very famous ClimateGate email, which is very important. And they were talking about they wanted to get rid of the 1940s blip. They didn't know how they were going to explain they were going to do it, but they did. They got rid of it. It's gone now. Okay, so was the 1940s actually hot, or were maybe just all the scientists until the year 2000 were just idiots and believed it was hot, but they were wrong? Okay, so a good example of this is, I've got a couple articles here from 1939, 1947, about how the glaciers in Greenland and Norway were facing catastrophic collapse. Things had warmed up. These are articles that were from the top Arctic researchers at the time. And they were talking about glaciers disappearing, lowlands getting flooded. And he said that the Arctic had warmed 10 degrees since 1900. So yes, that warming was real. Okay, so was there actually cooling after the 1940s? New York Times article. In 1961, there was unanimous agreement among scientists that the world is getting colder. And in 1963, the Canberra Times reported that glaciers were going in Norway for the first time in 200 years. So yes, things cooled down. In the 1940s, everything was melting, the glaciers were disappearing. By 1960, they were growing again. Of course that cooling was real, but it doesn't exist in the NASA, CRU, or NOAA graphs anymore. They've removed it. Okay, so this graph shows in black the 1981 version of the NASA graph, which had that warmth in the 1940s, and it's overlaid with the red current version. You can see they've just removed it. It's disappeared. It's fake news. Okay, so which one makes sense? This graph is from the 1975 National Academy of Sciences report. It shows glaciers melting in 1923 and glaciers going in 1963 when it was colder. That kind of makes sense to me as a scientist. Ice melts when it's warm and it grows when it's cold. Okay, so now let's look at the current NASA graph and look at the same thing. They have glaciers melting when it's cold and growing when it's warm. That doesn't work. The NASA graph is fake news. Okay, another famous thing which has been big in the news recently is getting rid of the global warming pause. Okay, in the most recent IPCC report, the global warming pause was central to the report. It was the big topic they were talking about. Why isn't Earth warming anymore? But suddenly in 2015, Tom Carl, the same guy from that graph I showed you before, he came out with a paper where all of a sudden the global warming pause disappeared. Temperatures kept going up at the same rate after the year 2000 as they did before. So science suddenly magically changed. Okay, and this is interesting because the one on the article on the left was after Tom Carl of that, Michael Mann, you know, the guy who got rid of the medieval war period, he was so upset about it. He actually came out and said, wrote a paper with a bunch of other famous guys from NCAR and elsewhere saying, yes, the pause was real, it really did exist. People who say it wasn't are wrong. So that there's this rift in the alarmist community at this point. Okay, but, all right, so the graph on the right shows in red and blue, it shows satellite data, which shows the global warming pause. The green line is NASA surface data, which shows steep warming after the year 2000. And not only that, they keep changing it. Like just between the election and December, they made it even warmer. They keep pushing the temperatures up. You know, this goes on. I think they felt alarmed by the loss of the election, needed to create more alarm. Okay, so just a couple weeks ago, John Bates, who is one of the two principal scientists at the National Climatic Data Center in Asheville, North Carolina, who just retired, he came out and said, yes, this data was mishandled. They didn't follow procedures. They did all kinds of things wrong. They rushed the paper, which disappeared the global warming pause out. Okay, so now let's take a closer look at some of the fake data which NOAA is generating. The map on the left is a typical one we see from NOAA. It's all red. The Earth is burning up. What was particularly interesting was the December of last year, they showed record heat in Namibia and around there. But the map on the right is their actual thermometer data. They don't actually have any thermometers in Namibia. So how do they know that it was record heat there? They didn't have a single temperature there. And satellites show that actually December was actually pretty average in Namibia. So they're just making up, it's fake news from fake data. Okay, Ross McKittrick at the University of Guelph in Ontario has done some excellent research on this. He's found that what's happened is that you saw, let me go back and show you. The map on the right, all those gray areas are missing data. There's no temperatures there. And what Ross discovered is that they've lost about 80% of their stations since the 1980s. But even worse, the graph on the right shows where the stations are located. This is on the y-axis is latitude. The average latitude has gone from 40 degrees from the equator to 32 degrees from the equator. So their average station's getting closer to the equator. So of course this creates warming because it's warmer at the equator. Temperatures warm up about 1 degree centigrade per degree of latitude. Okay, U.S. temperatures from NOAA are fake data. The blue line shows the average of all of NOAA USHCN stations in blue, and the red line is what they report to the public. They adjust the data, and the graph on the right shows how they adjust it. They do this hockey stick of adjustment, and you can pretty much account for almost all U.S. warming since 1900 is just being due to NOAA adjustments. They don't exist in the data. And there's very good records that the 1930s was extremely hot in the U.S. Steinbeck wrote about this with the grapes of wrath. You know, Wisconsin was having temperatures of 113 degrees in 1936. You know, Wisconsin rarely gets over 90 anymore. You know, temperatures like that are unheard of now. Okay, and once again, NOAA's losing station data. The graph on the left shows the percent of data that's fabricated, where they generate with a computer model rather than from actual thermometer data. And around 1970, about 10% of their data was fabricated. Now it's up to 42%. Almost half of the data which NOAA uses in their calculations is fake data now for fake news. But the graph on the right that's most disturbing is I've graphed atmospheric carbon dioxide versus the adjustment they're doing. What they're doing, it's almost a perfect correlation. They are adjusting the data to match their theory, which is the ultimate fake news in science. Okay, so 1907, this is a great article I love from the 1907 Monthly Weather Review. Is honesty not the wisest policy? It says the misuse of meteorological data that constitutes a crime against the community, and it's up to the independent press to call out cheats and hoaxes. That's people like us. All right, so the ultimate fake news is fake statistics to bully people into believing the absurd. And this is a great tweet from Obama a couple years ago. 97% of scientists agree climate change is real, man-made, and dangerous. That's just absolute nonsense. There's never been any survey which said anything like that. I don't think there's ever been a survey where scientists have even been asked if it's dangerous, because most of them would just start laughing, right? And the purpose of this is just to bully people. Okay, you're not allowed to think, right? Because 97% of scientists believe something. And it's the same story as the emperor's new clothes on the right. I mean, obviously the emperor wasn't closed, but because of 97% of the experts in the kingdom said that he was, people weren't allowed to question it, right? Even though it was obviously wrong. And that was the whole point of this 97% fakery, was just to bully you into believing things you don't actually believe. And my last graph just shows what is the purpose of reducing carbon dioxide? Well, this graph shows that basically quality of life goes up linearly with carbon dioxide emissions per capita. So if we reduce our carbon dioxide emissions, what does that do to our quality of life? It pushes it back to the left, it goes down. There's a very direct relationship there between those two. And that's what I believe, and I think my friends here believe the same thing. That's what this is all about, is hurting Western economies. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that was outstanding. I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and ask a couple of questions before we go to you in the audience. Because we lack a microphone, if you could stand if possible and tell us your name and your question in a somewhat authoritative, loud voice as much as you can muster. My first question is this, and this is to anyone on the panel. President Eisenhower is famous for his farewell address in which he warned of the military-industrial complex. What people forget is in that very same speech, he warned against what he called the educational industrial governmental complex, which was the increasing takeover of basic science and all scientific work by the government or government-financed entities. And you can look it up. It was very prescient. So what Tony's story is our government lying to us, or portions of our government are lying to us. So my question is this. In the 1950s, we had some independent science labs and entities. We had some independent weather forecasting. We had we had Bell Research, we had Edison Labs, we had a whole range of things. IBM did some basic science research. In the 1980s, at the height of the Cold War, when Ronald Reagan became president, he basically concluded that the CIA was giving him complete nonsense with regard to the economic capability of the Soviet Empire. The CIA statistics show that East Germany had a higher per capita income than Ireland. This was later proven to be incorrect. So what Reagan did at various points during his presidency is establish a Team B. These would be a group of outside people, skeptics, who came in and would look at the CIA's numbers, would look at the NSA's numbers, would look at the Pentagon's numbers and say, what's real, what are the probabilities, and is this being exaggerated or downplayed? And if you read the memoirs of various Reagan administration people, this proved integral in their thinking, which accomplished the end of the Cold War without firing a single shot. So my question to the panel is this. We've identified the fact that the tax dollars that we pay the government for scientific data are often misused and often used to combat the very economy which produces the tax dollars that they rely upon. To what extent do we need a Team B? To what extent how can we reorient government science programs so that other points of view are allowed and that the chances of manipulation of science and the politicization of science are reduced rather than strengthened?
Well, I'll take that since I've worked on EPA. We have these same issues. And I'll just give you a good example. 20 years ago, EPA's Independent Science Advisory Board disagreed with the agency, said, EPA, you're wrong, air pollution doesn't kill anybody. EPA didn't like that answer. So they replaced their Independent Science Advisory Board with a group of science advisors that were far less independent. As a matter of fact, 90% of them were EPA contractors and grantees.
Follow the money?
$300 million worth of grants. And all of a sudden, these people validate and understand EPA's conclusion that air pollution kills people. So there's two problems. I mean, EPA in particular is able to pay for the science it wants and and then it has the same people it pays to do the science review that science. Imagine you go through school, design your own tests and grade it yourself. That's kind of how EPA functions. So what I'm hoping that the Trump administration does is, I mean, ultimately, this will take Congress. I think EPA needs to just be removed from science. You can't be responsible for producing science and then regulating it based on the science you've invented. Its functions just have to be separated. In the meantime, at EPA, they have all these science advisory panels that are, literally stacked with contractors that have been paid by EPA. All those need to be blown out and reconstituted with people who are not on the EPA payroll. And just generally speaking, EPA has got to stop. It's built this whole university complex, which Eisenhower sort of alluded to, and it goes to these same guys and pays them all this money. They just produce whatever studies EPA needs. My particular interest is air pollution, and EPA has paid scientists to come up with a study explaining why breathing outdoor air is actually more deadly than smoking. I mean, it sounds funny, but it's actually true. I have a new book on this called Scare Pollution. But they completely scare pollution.
Available at Amazon and fine booksellers.
So government has completely corrupted science because science is not used to inform the government towards useful ends. It's used as a political tool to beat opponents to death.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I just want, that speech, that Eisenhower speech was one of my favorites, and he mentioned a couple of key points in that. He was a very visionary man. He said that the blackboard was being replaced by a computer and curiosity was being replaced by computer models. And that scientists quit thinking when they start doing computers, and that's exactly what we see going on with NASA. Now, everything is models now rather than observations, and that's a huge problem. And in that speech, he also warned about the danger of a scientific and technological elite taking control of policy, which is exactly what we've seen happen recently.
James, the British are famous for the Industrial Revolution, for curiosity, challenging conventional wisdom. It seems to me that there's been much less skepticism about the climate alarmist science in Britain. Is there anyone challenging the official point of view since East Anglia? Has East Anglia changed anyone's attitudes as to whether or not scientists need to be double-checked or have someone looking over their shoulders in Britain?
There's a few lonely figures. One of them is Matt Ridley, who occasionally writes for Wall Street Journal. He's a zoologist by training, and he applies the scientific rigor to the subject. And rather like Tony, he started out as a believer in global warming and looked at the evidence and changed his view. But no, I think on the whole, you remember we had a really useless prime minister. Almost like our Obama, a guy called David Cameron, except he was wearing a label that said conservative on it. At least Obama was not a conservative. And he came to power promising to lead the greenest government ever. Can you imagine? And he was in a coalition with the Liberal Democrats, who are like, sort of the Governor Moonbeam wing of politics in the UK. So you imagine this coalition. One of the terrible things that's happened, I think, to our thinking in the last 20 or 30 years of politics is that we've been inclined to think of energy and the environment as marginal issues. They're not core to the economy. Actually, energy, duh. If you have expensive energy, it slows down economic growth. It makes you less competitive. And I'm afraid that message still hasn't filtered through, even though we've got Theresa May is definitely an improvement, our new Prime Minister on David Cameron. I'd say there's still a reluctance to understand key lessons of history, like the Industrial Revolution you mentioned. It didn't happen because of wind power. It happened because of fossil fuels.
One final question before we go to the audience. Let's assume, for purposes of discussion, that regardless of the pause, and you might want to address the extent to which the cause is treated by the climate alarmists. Let's assume for purpose of discussion that there is global warming. It does present a long-term problem of some kind, of some extent. One of the things that James mentioned is that his third point was there are people who want power over our lives, and they use the cloak of climate change to promote interventionist policies, which are not necessarily the most effective in solving the putative problem they describe. I'd like to ask anyone on the panel, let's assume that there is a problem of some kind, of some type, of some size. What would you do that would be less interventionist, less expensive, less dirigiste to address the problem than what the consensus of the environmental community is on how it should be addressed?
I'll give an answer, but you go first. I was looking up something here.
Well, this is from a purely selfish point of view. And speaking as a full-time bicyclist, I would love to see carbon tax replace income tax.
But a real replacement, not an add-on.
Right.
Okay, gotcha.
Exactly.
Well, I guess I would, if there were a real risk, and I really have trouble.
I understand. This
Pretending.
is a thought experiment. This is a thought experiment.
Right. Well, it's hard to leave the solutions up to people who, are obviously corrupt, intellectually and morally. And, the face of concern would have to be some credible entity whose main interest was not just seizing power. Because the whole thing, even if you assume that there's some distant risk, it's all even that is very vague. And it would have to be, whatever, I'm not a central planner, so I can't imagine. But, we have a lot of, if environmentalists are really concerned about greenhouse gas emissions, well, why do they oppose nuclear power? I mean, we've had nuclear power
Good
for
point.
40
Good
years.
point.
They have.
Which is now much safer than it was 40 years ago.
Yeah, and there's, and so not only have they prevented the expansion of nuclear power, and they're choking it off now, but they've also prevented the improvement of nuclear power technology. I mean, there's lots of, you don't need to have these huge plants anymore. You can have much smaller plants. You can bury them underground. They're totally safe. They just get in the way of all these technologies. I mean, their only goal is power, so you have to get rid of that.
This is a very important point because their solutions are so disconnected to the actual problem they describe that you have to ask what is the real motive. I would simply add, go to the work of Bjorn Lomborg and the Copenhagen Consensus. I'll very briefly, but I'll just make one particular point. I don't think I'm stealing your thunder. He points out that let's take the worst case scenario of heat increases. You could solve that and more if you simply had a program in major urban areas. He studied Phoenix specifically, just painting rooftops and buildings white. If you just had them white, you would reduce the temperature to take care of the problem and even more. And because frankly, one of the reasons those areas are hotter is because of the concentration of buildings and the concentration of traffic. These are man-made effects. So if you really are concerned about the slight increase in temperature, which has been recorded, just start painting buildings white, but go ahead.
So the whole world would look like Mykonos.
Well, you could start with just the roof.
Right. I mean, I'm a great fan of Bjorn Lomborg in many respects. His book, The Skeptical Environmentalist, was one of the books that turned me on to my climate skepticism. And as you probably know, he's a man of the left. He was a greenie. He's a keen Greenpeace member.
Still is.
Yeah, still is. And actually, the reason I'm not a total fan of Lomborg is that he does concede territory to the enemy. He tends to accept many of their terms in order to advance his cause. I think there's room for everyone in this debate, but he does come up with some killer stuff. And he did an analysis of, you all know about the Paris conference last year, the COP21 in Paris, where all the world's leaders gathered to deal with the worst global crisis of our time. I mean, way more dangerous than ISIS or any of that harmless stuff. Global warming is the thing. And John Kerry, I think, told us it was the greatest threat to America, so it must be true. So everyone who came to this massive shindig, they all came by But they all pedalled over, by the way. They didn't use airplanes or anything, obviously, because you wouldn't, would you? I mean, that would damage the planet. So they all walked or swam or pedalled over. And they all came to these agreements at the end. And a little known fact about Paris is that none of the agreements anyone reached were legally binding. And this was thanks to the American delegation, which substituted one word for another. I think it was, they changed the word shall for may, I think it was. So something like that anyway.
Any contract lawyer will tell you that makes a difference.
Okay. Anyway, the point of, maybe I got the words wrong. The point of it was that every country submitted something called an INDC, intended national something contribution. In other words, what they intended to do, but they weren't obliged to do. And if every country in the world, in the unlikely event that it actually did stick to its intended contributions, the difference to global warming by the end of the century, first of all, the pessimistic scenario, that's 0.048 degrees Celsius. Now, the optimistic scenario, everyone is a good boy or girl and sticks to their targets. The reduction in global warming by the end of the century, 0.170 degrees Celsius at a cost of 1.5 trillion per year. Think of what you could do for 1.5 trillion a year. Think of the water issues you could deal with. Think of the overfishing problems, the real environmental
But their response would be, think of the educational, industrial, governmental complex you could create and feed.
That's another thing we can talk about later.
Well, we're going to go to the audience. We started a few minutes late, so we're going to go to 5 past the hour with the permission of our kind host, the E&E Institute. Kevin.
Hi, I'm Kevin Mooney. I report for the Daily Signal at Heritage Foundation. Somebody mentioned follow the money in one of the talks. Last year, Willie Soon, the astrophysicist from the Smithsonian.
Are we going to a question?
Yeah.
Okay.
My question is, when do we decide that public money is more holy than private money? Because climate skeptics have been attacked for receiving money, maybe directly from the industry. There's a figure I read that the U.S. government has spent tens of billions of dollars, $160 billion on climate change since the mid-90s. How much money do climate skeptics get from the federal government?
I think there's a lot of received ideas in that. We as conservatives, most of us here are conservatives, we are constantly fighting a major ideological war. And one of the big problems is precisely this notion in the public's imagination that somehow when the World Wildlife Fund and Greenpeace pump money into propaganda, it's okay because they're noble. Whereas when Exxon pays a researcher to do something, it's evil and tainted and wrong. This is a struggle we're all going to have to face. But the money is, as you say, all on the side of the greenies.
Yes.
My name is Brent Johnson. I'm a business owner in Utah. First question is a very simple one. The Environmental Protection Agency also has regulated things like pesticides, herbicides. Is the same skepticism alive and well with that, or is it concentrated on global warming?
Well, I would say there are a lot of problems with how EPA does all its regulation. I've worked on many pesticide and chemical issues and waste issues, what have you. And EPA has always abused the science. And there are, when it comes to pesticides, industry can sometimes successfully work with EPA. It really varies. It depends what the politics are. But I think EPA needs to be fixed so that we don't really have to worry about the politics. Let's just look at what the science says. EPA has banned many chemicals and pesticides wrongly and needlessly. We've heard about bed bugs. Okay, we shouldn't have that problem, but EPA has gotten rid of pesticides. We need insecticides.
So if you itch, you know who to blame. Yes.
Hi, Andy Paul, Daily Caller. Quick question. So you were talking about how a lot of this is apparently religious in nature. Can you just go deeper into that? How like environmentalism kind of is the new religion of our times?
I mean, America is almost the exception to the rule, but I think generally there has been a decline in Christianity, certainly across Europe. Church-going in Britain, for example, is really low. I think people have a need in their lives for the numinous in some shape or form. And I think if you look at, for example, of the cult of the act of recycling, if you look at all the evidence for recycling, it's really pretty pointless and useless. We now in Britain have to put our rubbish in about 5 different coloured bags, sometimes more, sometimes 10 bags. They then get carted off to the dump and then get mingled all together. There's machinery out there. We've all seen Toy Story 3, I think it is, where there's this machine that separates all the stuff out. You can do this stuff. You don't need to have this act of religious devotion.
But it makes you feel good.
It makes, well, some people feel good.
I would just say to that, the first and only time I ever met Friedrich Hayek, he said, "I warn the future. If we have a society that believes in nothing, we have a society where many people will believe in anything." And I think we've come to that in this secular age. Yes.
Bill Miller, I'm a retired U.S. Navy officer, and I heard the Heritage Foundation presentation yesterday about the Congressional Review Act, and apparently most of these rules weren't completed, so they're in a sort of incomplete state.
And your question is?
And are you familiar with this presentation? It was the Congressional Review Act, and the website, if you don't know about it, if I can quote the Heritage Foundation speaker yesterday, is redtaperollback.com, and this will tell you all about it. But apparently, the previous
And the question is?
Can we use this Congressional Review Act to either freeze or roll back these disputed regulations under the new administration?
So the answer is yes to the last minute regulations the Obama administration ushered out the door. It was
Which basically is June 30th of last year.
Yeah, it was used successfully. President Trump just signed the bill getting rid of one of the anti-coal regulations, the stream protection rule, which is not a stream protection rule, but a lot of Obama's damage was done before June 30th, so CRA is not useful for that.
Yes, it is.
Redtaperollback.com.
It's actually.
We'll get to you at the end. Way in the back, because we haven't gone to the back enough. Go ahead.
Me?
Yes.
Yes, Patrick Humphreys, Boston area. Last week, 2 weekends ago, there was a March for Science in Boston. We had 1,000 people turn out. April 22nd, there's one for 14,000 turning out. And of course, there's this counter narrative talking about scientists being prosecuted. You guys have been prosecuted publicly. I think your side needs to come out and talk about how you've been silenced, your research, how it's been squashed. And I really think that's something important. Is there any effort among the community to do that?
I have a very good story about that. I was very good friends with Dr. Bill Gray. He passed away last year. He was probably the top tropical meteorologist in the world. He'd been at hurricane forecasting at Colorado State University. Hurricane forecast is the most widely respected in the world. He was 87 years old when he passed away. He got money from NOAA for his hurricane research every year from the 60s until the 1990s. In 1993, when Al Gore became vice president, Al Gore invited him to come out to a global warming conference he was having. And Bill said, "I'd be happy to come to it, but you need to know that I'm not a believer in global warming." And immediately after they got his funding cut off, never got another penny out of the government.
Honesty does not pay.
Yeah. There's been persecution, and that's how they've maintained this consensus. Everybody knows, you toe the line, you get the money, you don't, you get cut off, you get ostracized. I would walk through the hallways at Colorado State University Atmospheric Sciences Department with Bill. People wouldn't even look at him because he was a threat to their funding.
My only suggestion would be this. Trump's budget is coming out on Friday. It's not going to be pretty when it comes to certain government science grants and other things.
Yeah.
The people who have been suppressed, the people who have had their livelihood attacked, the people who have been discredited in their careers, they need to be people who immediately are offered up to the shows and immediately offered up to reporters to tell their story, because once the budget is cut, that becomes a story. So the question is, why is the budget being cut for these dubious programs in science? And the answer has to be because there's another point of view and it has been suppressed. Yes, somebody there. Yes.
Yeah. I'm Jennifer Roback Morse. I'm president of the Ruth Institute.
Hi, good to see you again.
Hey, John.
Hi.
One word that hasn't come up yet, but that I think is germane to the work we do on the family side of things: population control. This is an area where, in the name of the environment, enormous powers being given to the government to suppress people's fertility in various ways. So could you guys just say whatever you want to say about the population side of this equation?
Thomas Malthus has been proved wrong time and time again, and Tertullian was saying this in the 2nd century AD. He was again making predictions about how the human population was running out of control. Every time it doesn't work. I think you have to be, I think as conservatives, certainly, we should be on the side of larger families, people having families, having the joy of children, and letting economic growth take care of the problem.
I was in Japan recently. You do not want to go and live in a country where the population is slowly dying. You do not. Yes, in the way in the back.
Can I follow
Oh,
up?
sure, please, I'm sorry.
Okay, so an interesting thing about that, John Holdren was Obama's science advisor. His close associate, Paul Ehrlich, at Stanford, in 1969, this was in the New York Times, he proposed putting poison in the water and food supply being shipped off to third world countries to sterilize them.
It's a different form of foreign aid than
John Holden himself advocated forced abortion before violence.
Yeah, and Harrison Brown, his hero, was a eugenicist.
Margaret Sanger lives. Way in the back. Yes, that's fine, go ahead.
Yeah, we've been beaten over the head and shoulders about global warming and so forth for 40 years. How do we change the narrative to get to the average person to get away from this 97, 98% agreement? That's garbage, but there's no real, way of doing it. These charts and graphs and talking about no data being manipulated is tough for
that's
the
a great
average
question.
person. But those
I understand.
newspaper clippings.
Look, that's a great question. Let me take the prerogative here. All of you can play a role. Here's something that they don't tell you because they don't have to. There's a scale of 1 to 100 on believability and credibility of information. And increasingly in a world of fake news, this is important. If you watch a political commercial on television, on a scale of 1 to 100, it rates at about a 25 in credibility and believability. That's about right. If it's a commercial for soap or cars, it's about 35 to 40. If you receive information, let's just say from email, from a friend, colleague, neighbor, or relative, it starts out at about 70 and goes up to almost 90. Each of you have email lists, friends, neighbors, relatives, and associates. If you were to take information from junkscience.com, realscience.com, breitbart.com, and you were to send it with just a couple words of you should be interested in this or comment to your list, you can be your own publisher. And the impact is far greater, even though your audience size is not huge. The credibility you have because they know you is dramatic. Yes?
Thanks. I'm Mari Stahl, and I was a senior policy consultant for the UN. Short-lived. I was an American, conservative, and I'm leaving sound science. I just didn't have a very good role.
You lasted 31 days?
So pretty much is about it. But here's my question that's sort of related to your discussion about budgets and title budgets and funding for these kind of junk science programs. Related to the UN, we all know about the $500 million that Trump donated on his way out. That's like the tip of the iceberg. Right? Obama, excuse me, Obama, if there's any press in the room, Obama. But that's the tip of the iceberg. What they're doing right now, what the UN agencies are doing right now is the forum shopping. And you've seen this so much in anything that you disagree on, especially when it comes to science. You go to a place where incomes a little bit better. No more so than in the UN right now. I just, as a word of caution, and perhaps I know that Heritage is in the room right now, Heritage Foundation.
Could you sort of get to the question?
All of these agencies right now are in the middle between Obama leaving and Trump taking office and ceding with the UN and our missions. They have all, every single one of these UN agencies have all established cabinet positions on climate change, World Food Program, FAO,
Okay, very
you name
good.
it.
Okay, before you leave, I would love your business card if you could give it to me. I may want to contact you and write about that in the future if you could see me before. Any comment?
Yeah, I mean, all this stuff is supposed to be, Trump's going to defund I mean, he has a campaign promise.
He can't take positions out, that's the
He
problem.
can't what?
These positions, he's.
Well, he
senior
can't fix that,
positions.
but, you know, if the money goes, the position's gonna go eventually.
But at least there's somebody in the world now. He's the,
Okay,
the first one
we-
needs to deal with this problem.
We have room for about 2 more short questions. We'll go in the back there, and then we'll go over here. Go ahead. Could you stand just so everyone can hear
I'm
you?
sorry, Linda Champney, Virginia. These graphs would shut a room for 15-year-olds instantly. I mean, is there any way these type of things, this type of presentation really needs to get into the school? I know, I'm just saying, some private maybe, but really, I can see, this would silence my 15-year-old.
Would you be willing
Just
to
having
share
extra information.
Sure.
That'd be great.
Actually, I want to correct.
Is it available on your website?
Yeah.
Aha.
There you go.
John, my actual website is Real Climate.
I'm sorry, my apologies.
Is it?
RealClimateScience.com.
See, that's good.
And do you do presentations in Colorado schools?
I haven't done any, but I'd be happy to.
Okay, one last question. Well, there, go ahead.
Climate change is devastating, particularly the computer code that got released. It's total fraud. What happened to it? I mean, I would have expected people to go to jail for at least funding to be cut, and it's disappeared without a ripple.
Well, instead they were searching for the leaker so they could send him to jail, I think. James?
Yeah, well, it is, but look, I mean, there are so many areas. I was thinking of the greatest environmental scandal in European history, or certainly in the last 30 years, diesel cars. Governments created policy which encouraged everyone to drive diesel cars, switch from petrol, which resulted in massive environmental pollution. Why did they do this? Because they'd heard that diesel engines produce less CO2. So they were prepared to ignore all the kind of nitrous oxide problems and all the particulate pollution because they knew that CO2 is the real problem. Heads are not going to roll for this. It's a massive scam which is only now starting to be turned around.
Well, thank you so much for coming. Thanks to our host and Evening Institute. The speakers will be going around and talk to people individually. And thank you all for your attention and your attendance.
Well, I have money up there for now.
I mean, if you ask me.